Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to VGU Talks, where we have a nice chat about what's happening in the world of games. I'm Don, the expert of calls from VideoGamesUncovered.com, and I'm now taking this in a new light. I'm going to add in some face cam stuff, so you can actually see my actual facial expressions and what. Well, let's make this a little bit more interactive so that you can see me, so that's great. And today on VGU Talks, we will be talking about violence in video games. Why? Because I have recently read this article on GameSpot, which involved an interview with Ken Levine, creator of the Bioshock series, who came out with his 2 cents on violence in video games. So I thought it would be an interesting idea to look over what Ken said, and also put my 2 cents on top. And kind of come and see if we can't get a conclusion out of this. Obviously, it's a really huge topic, everyone has their own opinions, and this is not the opinions of everyone here at VGU, it's just me. So, let's have a look and see how deep we get. So, this is what Ken says first in this interview. One of the reasons there's been a lot of violence in video games is because it's relatively easy to simulate. And you know what? I agree with that. It's completely agreeable. When I was at university studying games design, a lot of the things that we were taught how to create, write for, even program and things like that were violence based. And it just put an emphasis on, if you are to make something violent, it's easier than making something more dramatic, making something more romantic, making something more civil and peaceful. Because peaceful things are much harder to create than violent things. And I learned that from being at university. So you know what? I agree with that right off the bat. Let's continue. He then goes on to say, and generally, it's been like action movies. There's an easily perceivable market for it. I think the reaction to the violence is more an expression of people building confidence in the industry's ability to express itself in more diverse fashions. I can see that. It is more like an action movie. Like during the summertime, you're going to have films like The Expendables. You're going to have your big Marvel films. You're going to have the big action-packed films that are going to be stacked full of violence. And those are going to be the films that are going to be advertised way above all the romantic films, way above all the horror films for now, because the horror films will obviously get their big push in the October period when it is Halloween, because of course, Halloween period, scary movies, goes without saying. So yeah, I can see it's more along the lines of what's easier for the industry, rather than what's more diverse for the industry, hence why you see these companies going down specific paths with specific genres and gameplay styles, like Koei Tecmo doing the Dynasty Warriors games, for example. It makes sense. It makes sense. Now, the interesting part of this interview is that Ken was then asked by a lot of different people if he could remake the game without the violence in it. And we're talking about Bioshock here. Bioshock without the violence recreated. Can you imagine that? I don't think so. And to put into perspective, 6 million copies without violence. Would that work? Would it work? Well, Ken came out saying it's an interesting question to be asked, but he did explain that he wouldn't really know how to make the version of Bioshock Infinite that he had in mind without violence. He goes on to say this: I like games myself, and I've always liked gamey things, so I wasn't terribly interested in telling or making a game that didn't have a game component. When you have non-violent components, it would have been odd. And you know what? And you know, Bioshock Infinite, I can see that, because okay, yes, it is based on the Bioshock universe, so you're gonna have to have violence at some point. But it's the whole idea with at the beginning of a game, for example, it's not very violent, like in the other Bioshock games, because it has to lead you into the violence quite smoothly. You have to have that character progression to demand the violence to begin. But the violence is backed up by the story, so you have a reason to have that violence in that game. And by having that violence introduced via the narrative, now you have to implement gamey things, as Ken Levine said in his own words. And these gamey things are the gameplay mechanics. The gameplay mechanics have to allow the player to be violent in order to play the game. So, if the game doesn't feel gamey, is it then a game? And then that brings up the whole situation of, when is a video game a video game? Especially with more interactable games or point-and-click adventure style games, which some people think that they aren't nearly as much of video games as your Call of Duties, your Battlefields, your Bioshock Infinites. I disagree. I think games are an art form, and whether they have more or less gamey things, as long as it has some kind of gameplay interaction involving you making a decision, I think that's all you need to make a video game interactive experience, if you know what I mean. Well, that's just me. Let's keep going on and have a look at what Ken goes into more, shall we? Now, the rest of the article goes on about Ken Levine's thoughts on the future of video games and how digital distribution is going to get involved, including a little bit of an interview with Strauss Zelnick, the CEO, taken on the rights to Bioshock at 2K Marin, which I think is actually quite interesting. I'm looking forward to see what they do next with the franchise, because he says in this interview that the franchise is far from over, which I think is interesting. And plus, who wouldn't want to see a Bioshock on the new generation with PS4 and Xbox One, or even on Wii U? Why not? It'd be really cool. So the rest of the article goes on and deviates a little bit from the violence in video games bit, but Ken Levine does bring up some really good things about the more design area of violence, and how designing violence for video games is an easy and surefire way that your game is going to be sold. And I can completely understand that. I mean, come on, just look at the facts. Call of Duty is one of the best gaming franchises of all time, whether you like the series or not. Battlefield, again, it has a similar repertoire. Many of the games that are high up on our lists of best games ever all have violence in them. However, there are games that do not have violence in them that also stand up there as some of the best. One of them, for example, being Journey. Journey is absolutely beautiful, do not get me wrong. No violence in it whatsoever, and it's just all about this story of you going on, ironically, the journey. And it's just really well done. So violence in video games may be easy, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible to not create a game without violence. We have games like Flower, as I said, games like Journey, and many other it seems to be many indie titles that are doing this right now, which is quite interesting. But heck, if they get huge on the indie side of things doing games like this, then there's obviously a market. Journey wouldn't nearly have been successful if there wasn't a market for it, so I just give it all the praise in the world, because it's obviously done what the other companies now see as it works. People love violence in their video games, but they obviously still love their more casual, non-violent titles. So there's obviously a market. Okay, so does this mean that violence in video games is bad because it's a surefire way of getting a game sold, or an easier bet because it doesn't guarantee that you're going to get game sales? It just means that it's easier to create, easier to market, easy to this, that, and the other. Does it mean that it's going to be bad for like people growing up or people playing them? And I'm still not convinced. Violence in video games is just that, violence in a digital world. If you're gonna take that violence seriously, then you're not right in the head. And if you're not right in the head, then that, by all means, that's when you need to see professional help. That's when you need to get yourself sorted out. And if you're allowed to play these violent video games at your age, whether you be young or old, and you have these issues or you have these problems going on with you, then whoever's looking after you or whoever's responsible for you, at least in my opinion, should be blamed for this, because they're obviously not looking out, or they're obviously not directing you in the right way. Now, don't get me wrong, when I was raised, one of my first gaming experiences was Duke Nukem 3D on the PC. I was very young at the time, and of course it's an 18 rated game with nudity, a lot of swearing, a lot of blood, guts, you name it. But I knew it was a digital fantasy universe. I didn't take it seriously. But that's just me, other people will. And so it's down to the fact of, if you know you don't like violence, or if you know that you have a condition or something going on that may manipulate you into believing that this violence can or is a real factor in your life, then that's when you either need to take a step back and think, whoa, I may need to think of other games to play, or you may just want to go to someone that you know can help you to help you out and get through this so that you can enjoy these games. Because by all means, we all want to enjoy the games regardless, but if this is really going to affect your mental conditioning or how you're going to act in real life, and of course, that is the problem in the end of the day. But ladies and gentlemen, we're going to leave it there, and that's my take on violence in video games. Now, the interesting part. What do you think of violence in video games? The big one. What do you think about what I said, Ken Levine said? I want to know. I want to know everything. Your thoughts, my thoughts, Ken's thoughts, any thoughts. Leave your comments in the comments section below. It's incredibly easy, as you can probably imagine. And I will see you guys next time for another edition of VGU Talks. Until then, I'll be seeing you on the other side.